The Google Nexus really was the pinnacle of budget smartphones. Decent quality, great value, and the job was usually given to some good companies to get the work done in terms of hardware. But 8 years later, what exactly does a budget phone have to offer us? So, this right here is the Google Nexus 4, and I know what you're all thinking, Budget Builds has actually gone it, he's actually gone and spent some money on a phone. Well, that's sort of true, but these phones actually cost very little now, and that's what makes them a very good budget offering, which is appropriate considering the name of the channel. Released in November of 2012, it was definitely not a slouch considering its stupidly low price range of just £230. It was complete with a 4.7 inch, hence the name, IPS screen. It had the power to keep itself running with a smooth 1.5 GHz Crate processor, which was also a quad-core. Paired with an Adreno 320 graphics card for powering that pretty decent and high resolution screen, it also had all the added extras you could expect from a phone back then, with a solid enough camera, an aux port, 3G internet access, wireless charging, a glass back, you know the list really does go on and on, which is why this was such a surprising purchase for anyone that needed a phone back then. It did however suffer from the normal Nexus troubles, which meant battery life was mediocre at best, and well, there was no flash storage. And talking about flash, the phone didn't have flash support back in 2012, which people actually criticised it for. Anyways, while we get this cleaned up, let's just run through why this video is kind of a big deal. Back in the day, I actually was a big fan of the Nexus lineup for a long time. I had a Nexus 10 tablet, which is video pending if people want to see me fix it. I think it needs a new battery. I used a Nexus 6 phone for a long time, and they were all really good phones. And they were also good tablets too, because they were crazily good value. And that's one of the things that these phones really represented a change for. They were flagship phones that could stand the test of time, yet they didn't cost that much. But they did have their downside too. There were wobbles later on down the line with the 5X and 6P, which really didn't age all too well at all. But given how well my Nexus 6 still holds up, which is a phone that I have actual experience with, we're going to take a look at the weakest of the bunch, to see how an 8-year-old flagship phone, that was also a budget phone at the same time, holds up in the modern world. So let's break this down for you. I'm going to be living with this phone for a little while and using it for essentially all of my day-to-day tasks to see if we can get through a lot of them. We're going to be finding out how good the phone is still stock, and then later we'll find out if we can fix any problems, and you know, see if we can do anything more with it, with maybe some overclocking and maybe putting some new ROMs on it. Anyway, we'll be testing everything from battery life through to audio and games, so why don't we get round to finding out just how good this is 8 years later. So the nice thing about these things is straight from the get-go it's using stock Android, but it hasn't been updated to the latest version, which I suppose is sort of a good thing, but then sort of a bad thing as well, as it comes with its own issues. I am unfortunately its first user since some jolly time back in 2017, but Android 5.1.1 is much older than that. But I suppose if you gave this phone to someone that didn't actually understand phones, they probably wouldn't have any idea how old it is. It does look quite modern, and it does seem to work quite smooth so far. But let's see how things turn out over the next couple of days. Firstly, what really impressed me was the general speed of the device. Now I get it, I mostly end up using what are essentially bricks that were pretty bad when they came out, but this phone wasn't exactly the highest end thing in existence when it came out. So the general performance we're seeing from it is insane. Everything worked flawlessly out of the gates. I will say probably one of the best bits about it was that it came with an older operating system, and everything's exactly where you'd expect to find it. I do kind of miss the games that they used to throw onto Android, which is still here on this version of it, but still, everything from downloading some new apps through to updating all of the ones that are still on here and did actually need an update was easy to do. I will commend the phone for only crashing once during this, which was sort of, well, a UI issue that I wasn't too sure what happened, but was a strange quirk. Either way, that's probably down to lack of updates and being thrown into a modern day usage situation after not being turned on in a few years. But it was around this point I had yet to begin using the phone, and in terms of actually being a phone, it does alright. It does indeed do phone calls and all that jazz. In fact, its best use is actually still music and audio. Bluetooth and aux, you know, my phone doesn't have an aux port, this does. And it actually supports modern applications like Spotify, and it's a perfect little media device with no lags or hitches unlike some of the things we've seen on this channel, something that was unfortunately the case with devices that get much older than this as well. But I will however say that the built-in speaker was ultimately pretty useless. It's about as good as a wet flannel when it comes to audio, but why don't you have a good old listen? Moving away from that rather annoying interlude, it's worth mentioning that for now, well, not that I really get the time to play any games, it does actually run pretty basic ones fine here and there, and that's all we're really going to be testing till later on. They could take a long time to load, possibly down to that aging flash memory, but really, you know, everything seemed to run absolutely fine, and we'll run through a proper power test later on in the video, but that was my first annoyance. If you start running games on this phone, that very aged battery is going to drain in front of your eyes. Now, it's by no means a bad thing, it's definitely usable, especially for general usage, but once that graphics chip kicks into action, well, the phone does warm up a little bit and will cause havoc in terms of battery life. Videos, however, are no problem for the device, as are programs like Discord, even browsing the web. You know, something that people actually do on their phones is really, really good on this device, and with far more power than you can really use on day-to-day web browsing available to you. See, that's the thing, this phone was actually limited by how it was left in a stable state by Google. I know, the horrors of a device left that actually works. See, that's not usually the thing with Google, they like to update their phones a little bit too much, and then you can't really use them. But this phone is just really, really limited by not having access to the latest version of Android. You're limited on apps that it should be able to run, but it just can't because it's not supported on such an old version of Android. At least that seems to be the case. Either way, why don't we actually take a look at this phone and see what the community can do to give us a hand with running things. So, given that this is a Nexus phone, that means there is plenty of community-made ROMs for it, because there's a lot of support and a lot of love for these phones. And that's fair enough, because we've seen it's a pretty decent phone so far. Anywho, I decided to opt for a port of Lineage OS 15.1, which is Android 8 Oreo. Something much more up-to-date and much more in line with what we should be running on a phone in 2019. And to probably no one's surprise, it did actually help with using the phone. Now, the phone wasn't bad beforehand, I can't stress that enough. This phone on stock really surprised me, but it was mostly down to giving us better app support and slightly increased battery life. Not that the battery life increase was spectacular by any means, but anyway, why don't we push this thing to its limits and see just what it can do. So I decided to push some increased clocks to the CPU, only a couple of 100 MHz, but it's a simple overclock and something that really does help out. But let's see what that little overclock and a new OS can do with this phone. Is it still, well, it was never a worthless window pane, but still, it was semi-decent, but can it actually become a really solid phone? So we've already established you can live with the phone, but a lot of you have come here to find out just how well the phone holds up with maybe some modern applications thrown at it, so I thought I'd start up with something that's relatively simple, not exactly the height of intensivity, but that is of course Minecraft Pocket Edition, and for once of all, we're actually able to run the most up-to-date version of the app, something we usually don't get the chance to do. So I went on the App Store, downloaded the latest version, and it ran alright. We're pretty graphics limited here, as you can't really overclock the unit all too much, but anyway, the game could drop a few frames here or there when ran at higher settings, so I did drop that down slightly, but either way we got pretty decent performance and it was very respectable. PlayStation emulation overall was pretty solid with Metal Gear Solid. I know, that's excusing the pun. It was rendered in a slightly higher resolution than native and hardly dropped any frames whatsoever. PlayStation emulation has been a pretty decent experience for a while now, so I'm not all too surprised, but either way a very good experience. Unlike our next area, which I've always found to be a bit hit or miss. With, of course, the Nintendo 64. Now, don't get me wrong, simpler titles will run absolutely fine, so Mario 64 and things like that, you're hardly going to run into any issues whatsoever. But more intensive tasks or titles later into the development of the console? Well, these tend to struggle to be emulated. Most things like Majora's Mask and Smash Bros. I had to drop the resolution down to borderline native Nintendo 64 resolutions to keep the frame rate steady, but at that stage if I dropped it much lower we were limited by the processor and the frame rates just wouldn't go up, and yeah, you end up with a whole load of issues. Either way, this really did show that the device is aging a little bit now. Now, what did actually surprise me was Nintendo DS emulation with Drastic. Even some of the more intensive 3D style games like Spirit Tracks ended up running pretty decently. Now I'm utilising multi-core here and not running any extra graphics effects at all, but hey, the experience was pretty decent, we didn't drop many frames, and you've got a decent touchscreen as well to actually do stuff on, albeit a bit small, which makes it a bit difficult for me to, show you it running. Now it's around here I remembered the Steam Link app, and I'd been told that it's actually improved quite a lot since when I went to test it, so I thought I'd see just how well it holds up with some pretty old hardware. I mean, keep in mind this is an old phone, and do also keep in mind the PC I was streaming it from was quite a whiles away from the router and was connected via Wi-Fi. Either way, it ran really well with no decoding issues whatsoever. The main concern though is it did give way to how poor the Wi-Fi adapter on the Nexus 4 is compared to a modern smartphone. It's not particularly great, so I did have to move closer to the router to get a decent experience, as I couldn't actually test it while sat at the computer, but either way, it just shows that this phone does fall down in a few areas where you just expect a modern phone to be better. Anyways, a lot of people would have seen my little teaser image that I put out, and I said I'd try and get Dolphin to run on this device. But after trying 5 different versions, it took me ages to get one of them to launch. But it wouldn't launch properly and actually output a display to the screen. So what I managed to do with a bit of tweaking was get the phone to actually output to HDMI via the USB port, that was a thing on the Nexus phones, and actually got it to launch. And well, the performance was pretty dire. It didn't run very well, but I'm surprised it could actually launch a GameCube game. That's pretty impressive stuff for an 8-year-old phone. So, there we really have it, the Nexus 4 pushed to its limits nearly a decade after its original release. And honestly, it was pretty decent, it did alright. It could really do with a new battery, that's my main criticism. Battery life was a couple of hours at maximum, it really wasn't great. Either way, it does show that phones, honestly, they haven't really improved all that much in the last 8 years or so, with the main thing being that the cameras have got better, Wi-Fi reception's better, and that's about it. Generally, you could live with this phone as long as you accept that the camera is a bit subpar and the battery life isn't going to be great until you get a new battery. I mean, for all I've been using this phone, it's been so easy to swap between the Pixel 2, my phone, and the Nexus 4. Both are running stock Android and both are holding up really well. But the Nexus 4 is way older. My only point being that, it's not the hugest job in the world to do simple phone tasks. But what is impressive is doing it as well, or nearly as well, as a modern phone. I mean, I used my Nexus 6 right up until the Pixel 2's release, and that was running absolutely fine. But anyway, that is the Nexus 4 experience, not the Nexus 6, so it doesn't matter. And honestly, I really like this little phone. I don't know if I'd recommend you go out and buy one now, as you can probably get something from China that's equally as good and probably more powerful. But really, if you've got one of these lying around and need to use it as a spare phone, it's a really solid little device. And I'm really impressed. So I hope you enjoyed watching this review, I hope you enjoyed watching me push it to its limits a little bit, and good night. So there we have it, another phone video, and actually something people have been asking me to test for a while, and that was the Nexus 4, a phone I would have really liked to have back in the day. Either way, if you want to see more videos on this, on cheap phones, I mean I've got my Nexus 6, I've got my Nexus 10 that I need to fix at some point, do let me know, and you can always like and subscribe for more.